All right. It looks like we have a good amount of folks joining. Yeah, Gillespie's in the house. That's right. Well, let's go ahead. We'll get the ball rolling. All right. Today, we're going to be talking about the design to code process, specifically webinar topic, building component libraries with AI from your Figma designs. Oh, and I did want to ask as well, I know we did a quick intro in terms of where's everyone from, but curious what everyone's roles are. Do we have engineering, design, product on? CTO, James? Okay. Great. So we've got a mix. Let's move on to our next slide here. All right. So first of all, big welcome, whether you are live today or you're catching the replay after the fact. Certainly glad you're here. My name's Hunter Gillespie. I'm a solutions engineer here at Builder. So I work with our enterprise customers during their evaluation of the different Builder platforms. But again, this session is all about using AI to create reusable code components. And I will mention this as well for anyone joining later. This is a live interactive session, so feel free to drop questions, and there's a Q&A tab you can use, and spam the chat. At the end, we will leave room for Q&A, but hopefully be able to address those as we go. But looking at what we're going to be covering today, first of all, creating reusable code components is the first one. Then how you would use something like Fusion to theme an open source code component library with your organization's branding. And then last, integrating Storybook, and hopefully if we have time at the end, doing some prompt to code, some prototyping using our newly created design system. All right, now the reason for this webinar, this is something that a lot of organizations are running into in one way or another. At least that's what we're seeing in the field. A lot of companies tend to have fleshed out, mature design systems, generally in Figma, and that's the North Star. But for various different reasons, their code components haven't kept up. The classic drift situation. Maybe there are mismatched assets after an acquisition or a rebrand, and there's skips on the engineering sync, or maybe a legacy design system overhaul. Pretty common. Some Storybook prototypes exist, but without those synced code components, engineering needs to rebuild instead of reuse in order to meet those strict review requirements. And ultimately that slows down releases and ends up further widening the gap between your Figma and your code component library. And what this results in is much longer time spent in the redlining process. In some cases, we're hearing 20 to 40% of development hours are actually spent in those review cycles. And building on that, what we're left with is unclear requirements that cause the designs to stray from the design system, which cause unexpected complexities. Those are going to inevitably arise. The developers, they tend to build it out. It gets kicked back for red lines. There are missing states or other system mismatches, and these setbacks derail momentum and prevent you from shipping as fast as you would like. And the result of that is designers tend to feel left sidelined. Developers are buried in rework. PMs are missing deadlines, and ultimately the user experience is impacted. So not only are stakeholders frustrated, but it's costly because you're unable to iterate at the velocity that the business needs and ultimately demands. But Fusion allows us to close that gap. You can pull in your components right from Figma and generate reusable code. And we do also have built-in visual editing capabilities, which we'll show today. And there are a ton of use cases that Fusion is helpful for, but again, today in our webinar, we're going to be focusing on those use cases specific to creating, updating, and then using your design system code library, all using AI. All right, so without further ado, I guess let's get into the demo portion. All right, and before we actually get into the demo, I do want to set the stage here, especially for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with our Fusion tool. So we're going to kick things off here in the projects tab in my builder space. And before we get into this too, I'll say that everyone here, you can try this out for free if you sign up for it on our site. And I think Damien or Joe, they'll throw a sign up link in the chat for everyone interested. But especially since we have a diverse group of roles on the calls today, I will call out that there's a few ways that you can interact with Builder depending on your kind of preferred way of working. One, in the browser, which we're showing right now, but also locally for any developers that may be on. So we do have a VS Code extension, cursor extension, and you can also run it directly from the CLI. But one of the ways that Fusion stands out is that we can connect to your code base, connect to your design system, and have that as context. As you can see here, you can just enter a prompt, you can enter a Figma design and set it loose. It will definitely create that. Where Builder differentiates itself, our Fusion offering here is, again, you can have all of your different context looped in. And to briefly show you what that process looks like, we'll go ahead and step through connecting an app here. So if I select my Backstage app, we'll then select the framework that we're using. This basically just gives us the presets for our setup script and our run script. But the very next thing that Builder's going to ask us is if we use a custom design system. And in this case, the answer is yes. I would imagine the answer is yes for most of the folks on the call today. And it's going to ask us if that design system is in our main app, like in a folder, or if it lives somewhere else. And so we're going to connect to, in this case, we'll use Chakra AI. You can have multiple repos, design system attached to a single project. And then it's going to ask us what the AI should know about your design system. So this gives us a chance to add even more context regarding how this should be used. And looking at, I have a very lean example here, but what I'm telling it is when we're prompting, always use the components that live within my Chakra UI design system. You can also link your Storybook, any other external documentation you have, maybe it's zero height, for example. But really, the more context that we can feed into the AI, the better that output is going to be in terms of staying true to your design system. And Xander, I think there's a question there. And okay. And if you wouldn't mind putting that in the QA tab, that's easier for me to see. Does the AI process the information better if it's formatted in Markdown? That's what I use. I don't think it has to be. You can use plain text. And Aaron, I see your question as well. Can you add a design system to a pre-existing project? Yes, absolutely. All right. And I'll say this as well. We're going to talk about this later, but you can also set this up as a template, right? So those design system instructions, maybe you want to have a blank canvas, especially for designers. This is a pretty common use case where you may want to use the traditional vibe coding experience where you, again, you come in here, enter a prompt or a Figma design and just have it run loose. But it's definitely worth it if you take the few extra minutes to connect your design system, add some instructions so that you get that vibe coding experience, but with your organization's branding guidelines, design tokens already included in that. And I see a couple questions here. How would you recommend going about it if the design system is ad hoc? Yeah, that's a good question, Anna. Let's put a pin in that one for now. Hopefully this will answer some of the questions, but let's move on to our demo itself here. Now, I will say this, Fusion is agentic. This can run for 10 minutes plus when we enter a prompt, depending on how large it is. So I do have a few different scenarios set up for us to walk through today that we can hop between as these prompts are actually running. But the first one is really the core use case to talk about today, which is turning your Figma design system components into reusable code components here. So what I have, this is a starter Storybook repo. This doesn't have anything in it right now. And we're going to be bringing in our components from Figma. So moving over here to our Nexus design system, this is an open source Figma library. I try to customize it using our design tokens, our branding guidelines. And we're going to start with our checkbox component. And you can see here's all the different variants. We can click in on those. But now we're going to open up our Builder Figma plugin. And for anyone that hasn't used this, we do have a very deep integration with Figma. It's certainly something we take pride in. And if we use this smart export, this is essentially going to scrape all of the data available in our selection. So the nodes, the layers, states, variants, and basically create a big data blob that we can give to the AI to transform into code. And it looks like it copied it. Great. We're going to have it create our checkbox component using this Figma design. And Chris, I don't know what the hard limit on the number of nodes is. Maybe Damien knows, but I think typically I've run into that issue about 1,500. All right, we can see this is running. And so what this is going to do, it's going to be creating one, the component itself, but also the corresponding stories, any other documentation for the different variants. I'm looking at the questions here. Yes, so you can definitely go straight from Figma to create code for a design system to use for future use gen. That's actually something we're going to be covering today, hopefully, if we have time here at the end. All right. And so moving on to our next example, while this one is running, instead of watching the paint dry, we're going to move along. This is something that's come up with a few of the folks that I've talked to. They've done something similar where their code components are, very out of date. They want to modernize, they want to use AI tooling. So they've adopted various open source code component libraries, ShadCN, Material, Quasar, Mantine, you name it, but they use those as a launch point. So this is a reverse flow of that other one, where in this case, I have my design tokens already here in the app, our color palettes, our fonts, and I have those plugged in and have the instructions for it to basically create themed components for us using Material UI. So in this case, we'll have it create our button component. Megan, yes, this will be available post live stream. All right. All right, that one's running. Let's see if our checkbox is complete. I see a question about security, and our company is forbidden to connect to corporate GitHub with not approved tools. Yeah, and there's definitely options if you have an enterprise GitHub. I don't know your name, anonymous attendee, but certainly reach out if that's the case, because there's options. And again, this is also something you can work on locally if you have a checked out branch. And I see there's a question if we can do something like this with Flutter Web. Damien or Joe, do we have a documentation with the list of supported frameworks that maybe we could provide? That might be helpful for the group here. And Jeremy, I see your question. Actually, I see a lot of questions in the chat. If you wouldn't mind moving those over to the Q&A, that would be helpful. But I see a few about what Git providers are supported. So I'm using GitHub, but we do also support GitLab, Bitbucket, Azure DevOps, and also the enterprise versions of these if you do have a hosted solution. Okay, and it looks like this one finished first. So here's our button component that it created. And we can see our different states here, what this looks like, small, medium, large, and we can interact with these and grab the code. We also have a list of our design tokens here, some documentation. And this is something that comes up, at least with some of the designers that I've worked with, where they have questions of, do I always have to specify the hex color? Or can I talk to the AI and tell it to use our primary brand color, use the semantic labels instead? And hopefully this answers that question. You can absolutely just refer to your semantics as well. All right, so our next component here, let's do we'll do the text field component. And certainly here, we don't have the same limitations as the Figma import, where there's a limitation on number of nodes. But I will say best practices, and we can throw in kind of the prompting best practices in the chat too, is when you're working with these AI tools, it is better to chunk it up if you can. You're going to get a better output generally and have to do less rework on the back end, especially this being a live demo. That's why I'm going one component at a time, but this could definitely do a few different components at a time, a group of them if we wanted to. So like Mike, yeah, that would answer your question about the batch import of components. You could, but you might not get the same quality of output, especially depending on how many variants are there in your components. If they're very basic, it probably wouldn't have an issue with it, but just something to keep in mind. Let's do a refresh here. If not, we'll do some live troubleshooting. Okay, great. So we did just need a refresh. So here's our checkbox, and this looks pretty good. Let's say there were some things that we didn't love about this. We can also use the design tab. So this is a big differentiator for Builder. Not one, being able to use all of your existing code, components, other context, but also being able to have a visual editing layer. And I'm not going to make changes here. I'm definitely not a front-end designer, but this will look very familiar to all of you on the call that are. You can see we have a very Figma-esque, right, where we can select the different layers, change the font, the CSS properties, the margin and padding, all of those different things. And we may do a little bit more of this later on, but for now, let's move on to our next import. And let's do our button component next. And we are going to do some more complex Figma imports as well, but want to show a couple of the basics, especially because these have a lot of variants. Right, so here's our text field that it created. And there's definitely some things that I don't like about this. The standard variant, I think we could probably get rid of. These don't look too different. But the floating variant, that doesn't seem to be actually floating, just as a troubleshooting tip, you can actually click a different part of the page that you want to specify. You can also use the @ sign, or we could say at input. But here we're just going to say ensure floating variant. is actually loading. Vera, I see your question about exporting tokens. Is that from the Figma side? On the Figma side, I just used a plugin and it just gives you a JSON blob of all of your design tokens. There may be a better way to do it, but that's how I did it. And Megan, I see your question about, could you ask Fusion to create a Storybook project with Mantine components, for example? Yeah, it's a good question. It does go off of the starter templates. And I don't think right now we have a Storybook starter template, but you could pretty easily spin one up. And I'll also say that typically for Storybook apps, they won't be Storybook alone. It'll be something else plus Storybook, and it's like a separate way to run it. But I'll show you, how we can install that. We're going to actually do that on this repo here. And let's do one more component. We'll have it create a card. And then after that, we'll actually build out some documentation here and we'll go ahead and install Storybook. And I see there's a question about a bi-directional sync. And let's see if I can find that one. Yeah, Daniel, how do you access modals or dialogues in the design tab? That's a great question. For that, those generally won't be available there just because in that design tab, it's using an iframe and those are, I don't know, ephemeral or in their state where it only shows up if you click something else. So what I do typically is I'll just tag that modal in particular as a code component. All right, so here's our button. We can see all the different variants. These are interactive, so this looks pretty good. All right, now let's do a more complex import from Figma. And Ricardo, did you have a question? I think I see you raise your hand. Sit at the top. I don't see your question yet, Ricardo, but I will come back and look for that. Okay. So hopping back over here, we'll do a more stateful component, something a little bit more complex. Let's do the progress indicator. Or how about this? Let's do pagination. Pagination. I don't know how to pronounce that. And I see a question about connecting Builder to Storybook. So yeah, again, Storybook is typically going to be on another repo where you could run Storybook in a couple of different ways. But here, I'll show you after we get this one going. So when you connect to that Storybook, basically all you want to do when you select the framework is this is going to have these commands pre-populated and you may have to change it. But yeah, you just want to make sure instead of npm run dev, you have it say npm run Storybook or yarn Storybook, however you run yours. But yeah, it'll be able to run it. A good question. Xander, yeah, and great question. So the question from Xander is for the text field component, and we're talking about this one. Are the styles and the design tokens already imported? And in the button example, are you guiding the output directly from the Figma plugin? Great question. And I do have my design tokens here in just like a markdown file for when I created that app. So it knows what our colors are and, what font to use. And I also have some instructions just in terms of what I want it to include when it's making that output. And let's say for the card component here, I spelled that wrong. Just say add more sample data. Guzman, does Fusion support multiple repos with Docker? Potentially, yes. We do have a path for a Docker container that you can enter that. What other questions? And after this card component, after this runs, Megan, I'll show you Fusion. Again, it can run those install commands for us, so we can actually install Storybook here. Now, it's a separate step if we wanted to run it, but it's not a problem to do that initial setup here on the Fusion side. Mike, are custom fonts only recognized via this method of documentation versus a one-shot prompt? I think that's really going to depend on the font. If it's something that's publicly available, yeah, definitely it can install those fonts and bring those in. But if it is something proprietary or paid that we don't have access to, all right, let's try that again. If not, we'll switch back to Sonnet. Okay, there we go. That's running again. Okay, so here's our card component. Aaron, I see your question about, can you tell a project to use a component library like Prime View and it just knows it, or do you need to purchase the design system from Prime One? Yeah, it's a good question. So if it is something that's paid, either like a code component library or a Figma design, like a Untitled UI, they have a free version, a premium version. You could certainly do it with the free version, but I don't know if there's a way to skirt paywalls there. And I will say this as well. Fusion, what's pretty neat about this is self-healing. So when it does run into these runtime errors, you get that option to just click attempt to fix, and it'll actually be able to scan the console, anything in the terminal, the network, and try to fix its own errors, which is nice. Thinking very hard. All right. And we can also, I guess we're at 30 minutes. Let's see how quickly this can update itself. Oh, here's a good question. How do designers and engineers collaborate using this tool at Builder? Yeah, so this is a very good question because the goal really is here to democratize development in general. So one, you can send a pull request from here. So for example, let's say you have a designer on your team and they want to build out that component library, right? Maybe they don't want to do commits on your main app, but they feel pretty confident updating your Storybook component library, for example. They can send a PR directly from here. And then on the engineering side, maybe you don't want to use Builder. You can check out that branch make any changes that you need to make, and then directly from here, you can sync from that latest pull request and bring that in. All right, let's see our pagination components. Fantastic. This looks great. And now that we've done a few components as well, I guess we'll hop back over here to the Storybook first, and we'll install this as soon as it's done with this component registry. And Peter, I see your question coming from the developer side. I have lots of components in a code base split up into an API and a React front end. Can Builder actually parse my API code base and hook components up to my endpoints? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so I will say that this is primarily a front end tool, but that said, this can connect to your live APIs, whether that's your choice if you want to give it access to prod or you have a dev or a staging server, but absolutely this can talk to your APIs. That's a great question. All right, so here's our card component. It doesn't look exactly the way that I want. That's live demos for you, but let's say at this point we want to install Storybook. So what we can say, we'll go ahead and run that. And we should actually be able to see it run the bash command. It has a kind of a built-in terminal, and it'll install that for us and create those stories. Great question there, Tawan. There was a question, is there anything designers can do in Figma to improve the results in Builder? Something like using auto layout, adding descriptive layer names? Yes to both. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think that's our recommendations. And Damien as well. I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that, but those are the two. And really the auto layout is the biggest thing for having those high fidelity outputs. But there are actually, it depends on what your setup is. If you do have a corresponding code component library already, there's also functionality on the builder side, commands that you can run that really increase the fidelity in terms of using your code components, right? So if you were to import a page design from Figma that's using your components, Builder would know which of your code components to use to build out that page. Can Builder use this color? If we use styles in Figma for colors, fonts, can Builder use the color styles in typography? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so I chose to use the design tokens, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of different ways that you could do that potentially. All right, so we've created this. And since we have about 20 minutes left here, I knew we wouldn't be able to do the whole library, so I've already built this out here when I was preparing. So I already did all of the imports to make sure everything came over the way that we wanted. And what I've done is I have connected this to a template on the builder side so that you can see what this looks like for Builder Fusion to actually create things with our code components. And I will say I've been doing some testing here. Again, I'm not a front-end designer. I forgot to add some rules around spacing and things along those lines, but I think you'll still find it pretty interesting. And Ben, I see your question. Does this work with a mono repo in a multi-instance Storybook? Yeah, that's a good question. It shouldn't be an issue. You'd probably want to run one at a time or write two one at a time. Paul, I see your question about could Builder harmonize and update our Figma canvas with components from the dev repo? I will say this, like right now it's a one-way import. Like you can actually import things into Figma from Builder, but it's not the way that you're describing. Yeah. Yeah. So Fusion's updating the code side. It wouldn't be able to write back to your Storybook, at least right now. So here's our design system again, and then we have this connected to, sorry, here we go, a starter template. So here in this case, like React and Nexus, where I have just a very basic hello world application connected here to our design system. And we'll give it something basic, and we could do a few of these too if we have time. And we'll give it just something very general. I see some raised hands. Yes. Yeah. And there's a question from an anonymous attendee as well. If you include documentation on design principles, usage scopes for components, do's and don'ts, or will you see more accurate use of the system when prompting? Absolutely. Yeah. Again, the more context that we can feed in there, the more instructions, the better that output's going to be. And I'll throw this in the chat as well. Previously, we were limited to our builder rules file and the agents file, but we've recently changed that where you can now have a whole folder full of those markdown files like you were describing. So if you wanted to have one for layout, one for design tokens, one for how to use navigation, things along those lines, you could just have that within a builder rules folder rather than in a single file. So that's running. And when we're looking this, so as it's thinking, it's going through that process, I wanted to show this part. So you can see right now the agent task, it's actually researching our design system components. So it's actually looking through that repo that we connected here and looking at how this is being used, the different usage examples that we have, the variants, things along those lines, and trying to put those pieces together. You can see that right now it's importing those components. Okay, so we do have Storybook running locally. I don't know if I believe that, but the point being is we now have two ways to run this app. We would run like npm run Storybook, and that would open up a Storybook version, and it would show all of our different stories that it made here. But we now have that available, and we have kind of two ways to interact with this app. But hopefully that answers your question, Megan. See the question. If you update a design in Figma, do you have to import the new styles again into Storybook? Yeah, I would imagine so. I will say that I'm not a Storybook expert, and I have talked to folks who have an automated process where, when they update Figma, it goes back over to their Storybook. Let's say you wanted to build out the code side with Fusion, that would have to be a manual process on your end. And yes, I think there were a few questions about theming, and that's absolutely something we support. That's normally something I show in demos to customers, how, let's say you have an app that already has a light and a dark mode. As Fusion is building out pages, those pages will inherit those same themes. Oh yeah, Colin, I don't think I put that in the chat here. The configuration fundamentals, there you go. Okay, so here's our app. We didn't give it a lot, but we got something here. And if we look at the code output, here we go. Again, we can see it's actually using those components that we created. And if you all have done a lot of experimenting with other vibe coding tools that don't necessarily have that context, you're familiar with the output, it generally looks great. Don't get me wrong, but it's not using your component library. It's an HTML soup, if you will, whereas this is using everything from our actual Storybook design system that we connected. Now looking at the questions here. Does this enable Storybook plugins such as writing unit tests? That's something I wanted to try. I didn't have time to get to it, Ben. But yeah, I think, I don't know, it's definitely an interesting scenario. I could have used some testing on the fixes that I just needed to do based on, again, not being a designer. But let's say we wanted to make some changes here. We could certainly do that with the design tab. And let's see if I refresh, that shows back up. Mike, I see your question about, let's say you're a team of designers with no devs or engineers on staff. Do custom plans include helping teams with this setup during onboarding? That's probably a better question for someone on the sales side. But yeah, well, depending on the plan, there are various degrees of helping you get onboarding, but we want you to succeed either way. Conflict syncing the repo from an anonymous attendee. Yeah, so really good question. We do have the ability to, let's say someone's working on it locally, you're working on it here in the browser, you can actually sync those changes directly from here. And right now this is a fresh repo, so it's just saying design to code, but it should say pull from latest PR or something along those lines. And that's been a good fix. Okay. And we could do more of these prompts, but I guess that's everything that I wanted to make sure that I covered for the base demo here. But yeah, what other questions, or if there's any other prompts that people want to see with our design system, we would be happy to experiment. Can you import tokens from Figma? Yeah, Chris, you can. I would recommend just exporting those as like a JSON blob and putting those in a JSON file, or having something just reformat it into Markdown. But that's probably the best way to do it. Let's look at the other chat here. Yeah, we could do a couple more bigger imports too. Let's do a table component. Something that has components living within the design system component. And can you all hear me, or have I been on mute? I might have been muted. Okay. Sorry about that. Great. So I don't know how long I was on mute. Hopefully not too long. We were changing some padding here to make this look a little bit better. There we go. And we can change the alignment on this page. Let's say we want to replace this with some type of logo. I think I have some logos here. I'll use Discord as an example. Okay, that's a little big. Let's not use that one. or if I have any icons, we could change that. And there is a question about a diagram that shows the flow of information from Figma to Builder to Storybook. I think we do have documentation on those. I don't know if it's all in one place, but there should be scattered diagrams that would help you piece that together. In the design tab, are your tokens available? Great question, Eric. Yeah, and this comes up from time to time, especially when businesses are very strict about their branding guidelines, where they may want folks to be able to come in here and prototype as code, but they don't necessarily want to allow them to change everything. For example, for the text color, I could change this to any color I wanted. But we do have this design tokens tab here. And I don't have any registered, but essentially what this does, this would just be a JavaScript file you put in the root of your repo. And it basically has a list of all of your different design tokens so that when someone were to click, hey, here's what the text color could be, it would show them a preset drop down of the allowed text colors on your end. And yeah, that absolutely applies to margin and padding as well. If you wanted to have a small, medium, large t-shirt sizes for those, margin, padding, really anything else. Yeah. I think, okay, we had our last prompt here. Did it actually build the user settings page? Yeah, and so I'm giving it a very generic prompt. Mark, yes, I think it started to, and I don't know, let's see if it will route us there. Okay, so it did. We have our user settings page as well, and this is all using our inputs. We can select between the different languages, other preferences, and I'm sure there's a few things that we may want to change here, especially along the lines of spacing, layout. Right now, it looks like it's trying to, it has the breakpoint set pretty small. I think that's probably part of my design system instructions. But I ran this earlier today and it created something very similar to that. Rohit, there's a question about using auto layout in Figma for best practices. Yeah, yeah. So there's definitely a doc on that. Maybe Damien or Joe can throw that in the chat on just generally the Builder Figma plugin. Okay, great. I see we've got some Otter AI notes. Fantastic. Can you try generating something more complex, such as a dashboard with some data visualization? Yeah, absolutely. Let's try it. I can't guarantee that it'll be done in the next 7 minutes, but we'll give it a shot. All right, thank you for the notes in the chat there. And appreciate the suggestion, James. Yeah, we'll see how far it can get. At least we'll be able to see the thinking process as it's going. Figma modes. I see your question, Serkan. Candidly, I haven't used it, so I can't say for sure. But yeah, we do have about 5 minutes left, and I think we're gonna watch this prompt work. We'll watch Fusion 2 on that one. This is a larger prompt, but we'll see how far it gets. Any other questions? Hopefully this has been useful for everyone, especially with creating the code components like the core use case for the webinar, but keep the questions coming in. In the meantime, we'll go up to the top of the hour. Yes, Amy, Flora, thank you. Oh, and I guess one last thing here for the group. And I will say that this is not available on the free plans for those of you that do have very mature design systems, we do also have a feature called component indexing, which is a one-time prompt that basically allows Fusion to deeply understand your design system so that when you are doing those imports from Figma, it knows exactly what code components to use. And I know Josh did a webinar a while back on this, but I don't know if we had the visual here, but this is an example of after we ran this. I wasn't sure if we'd have time to show this today. You can see how far this scrolls down. But usage examples, integration patterns, which just overall increases its ability to use your design system. Awesome. And okay, here we ran our prompt. Yeah. Yeah, certainly some things that we could work out here. I did not set up the components to, again, have all the right spacing, but I'd say this looks pretty good, especially for doing it in 4 minutes. And again, if we hop over to our page where I built this out, it is using our charts, our tables, all those different things. Pretty neat. Thank you, Colin. I appreciate the engagement, everyone. I think at this point, I see everyone saying thank you. We're about 2 minutes off. We'll cut it short here. But thank you again, everyone, for your time, your questions, and we'll see you on the next one.